A forest ranger was patrolling a forgotten part of the woods when he stumbled upon a giant rusted door hidden deep inside a rocky cliff. He thought it was an old storage bunker or a tunnel, but what was waiting behind it was something no one was ever meant to discover. Subscribe, hit like, and let us know in the comments. Would you dare to open that door? And where are you watching from? Ranger Elias Ward had walked these woods 1,000 times, enough to know every bend in the river, every towering pine leaning just slightly more than the others, every place where elk often crossed the old logging road. He loved the quiet and the rhythm of his patrols, the way the forest spoke in subtle sounds, rustling needles, distant bird calls, and the steady hum of wind sweeping through open clearings. Out here, far from the hum of highways and the chatter of townspeople, the world felt exactly as it should be, wild, steady, and honest. Yet from the moment Elias read the patrol assignment that morning, something about the day felt slightly off balance. The map on his tablet displayed a familiar grid of the protected reserve, but his route line cut closer than usual to a territory he privately thought of as dead ground. It was a section with minimal documentation, a leftover fragment from older maps that predated the reserve's founding. No tourists ever walked there. Rangers rarely did. In briefing documents, it was politely labeled Restricted Zone B14, a designation more bureaucratic than informative. In campfire jokes among Rangers, it was simply called the place the Cold War forgot. He slung his pack over his shoulder, thinking little of it at first. Chances were he'd see a few deer, maybe chase off a camper who ignored signs, and make the long loop home before sundown. But a faint line of unease trailed him as he locked the station door and headed out along the dirt path. The sun had barely risen, and golden light cut across the tree trunks in angled beams, dust swirling lazily in their glow like tiny suspended stars. Hours into the hike, Elias noticed the first sign that the day would not be typical. It was subtle, the kind of detail only someone who'd spent years learning how to read a forest would catch. A narrow strip of grass lay bent in a direction that made no sense for the wind patterns. Fresh boot impressions, too large for a hiker and too uniform for a hunter, led off the designated patrol route. He crouched, brushing the edges of a print with his gloved fingers. Whoever made them wore heavy work boots. The impressions were crisp in the dirt, tidy along the sides. They couldn't be more than a day old. Elias straightened slowly and scanned the woods. Nothing moved. Just the soft whispering of pine branches overhead. He checked his radio by instinct. It crackled, but held a weak signal. Better than he expected for this part of the reserve. That alone told him something important. No ranger had been nearby recently. They never got this kind of reception in B14. He followed the tracks. They wound through the trees, dipping behind a fallen trunk covered in moss so thick it felt like velvet under his palm when he steadied himself against it. Every few meters, the prince paused or turned slightly, as if the unknown traveler had been searching for something. Elias walked slowly now, caution drawing his steps tighter and quieter. People who wandered where they weren't supposed to rarely had innocent reasons. Soon the terrain changed. The ground rose gradually into a jagged slope scattered with boulders. When Elias reached the top, he found himself facing a rock formation he had never seen before. Tall slabs of pale stone, stacked together by ancient force rather than human hands. Their edges were rough and chipped, with long cracks running like frozen lightning up their surfaces. At first glance, it seemed like an ordinary part of the mountain shelf, but something about the pattern felt wrong. Too straight, too deliberate. His heartbeat ticked a bit faster. He stepped closer and brushed away a strand of creeping vine that clung to the stone's corner. His gloves scraped metal, not rock. He paused, knelt, brushed again, harder this time. Beneath the layer of vines and dirt lay a flat, cold surface, steel. Sunlight glinted weakly off a peeling film of dark red paint. The surface extended horizontally farther than he expected, the edges straight enough to draw a ruler against. He followed the seam with his hand until he found a recessed latch, stiff with rust, but unmistakably mechanical. Elias sat back on his heels and exhaled slowly. He had stumbled upon a door, massive, industrial, buried into the rock. Not a trap door for wildlife management or a simple shelter. This was something far older, far more serious. something that had been deliberately hidden, and for a very long time. Jesus, he muttered under his breath, eyes fixed on the sealed entrance. No one in the Ranger database ever mentioned a structure like this. Nothing in the territorial reports hinted that the ground beneath his boots held more than tree roots and stones. So why was it here? And who had been inside recently enough to leave those fresh tracks? He leaned in, pressing his ear against the seam. The metal vibrated ever so faintly. At first he thought it was his pulse thudding in his head until he recognized the steady rhythm. A low hum echoed from within. Machinery, ventilation, electricity. His jaw tightened. If the interior systems were working, someone had to be maintaining them, or at least living off them. He took a step back and studied the surrounding rock face again. The vegetation had begun to reclaim it. Moss crept over the upper corners, roots searching for cracks to invade, leaves scattered along the base. Decades must have passed since this door last saw the sun, but not centuries, not long enough for nature to fully swallow it. A part of him stirred a mix of curiosity and dread. Protocol told him to radio headquarters immediately. Let security specialists and historians handle whatever relic he'd uncovered. But his instincts developed through years of unpredictable encounters in the wilderness told him that waiting could be a mistake. If someone was inside, they might be injured, or armed, or terrified. The prints he'd followed weren't heading away from the door. They led directly toward it and then stopped. He pressed his hand against the steel and pushed lightly. The door didn't budge. He found what looked like large locking bolts rusted tight from time and neglect. With effort, he grasped the thick handle embedded in the surface. He braced his boots on the ground, leaned his shoulder in, and heaved. For a moment, nothing happened. The metal groaned faintly under strain. Elias grit his teeth, repositioned, and shoved again harder. Something cracked, rust breaking free. He pushed once more, and this time the door jolted inward a few inches, scraping loudly against the stone floor. Cold, stale air seeped out, carrying the sterile scent of metal and dust. The darkness on the other side felt almost alive, swallowing light like a mouth that hadn't eaten in decades. Elias stepped back, breathing heavily. The door now stood open just far enough to show a sliver of what lay inside. A narrow corridor of steel walls, cables hanging in bundles along the ceiling, and a dim flicker of emergency lights deep within. He looked over his shoulder at the sunlit forest, the arching branches framed in gold, then back into the void, two worlds separated by a few inches of movement. His radio crackled again, just static this time. A reminder that if he went in, no one would hear from him until he returned. If he returned. But he had made his decision the moment his fingers traced those fresh boot prints. Whoever had gone inside had yet to come out, and whoever lived in this forgotten place might not be safe or might not be stable. He drew a steady breath, reached up to tighten the strap of his flashlight, and widened the gap further. The door screeched like a wounded animal, echoing through the stone passageway as if crying out at being disturbed. Without another thought, Elias crossed the threshold, leaving the warmth of daylight behind as the door creaked shut behind him. The beam of his light cut through the blackness, illuminating dust particles suspended in still air. The metal beneath his boots rang sharply with each step, each sound traveling too far down the hall. His instincts sharpened like the edge of a knife. Something in here was humming, breathing, waiting. The corridor stretched deeper than he'd imagined, disappearing into a darkness that carried a different kind of silence, one shaped by concrete and steel instead of wind and wildlife. The atmosphere pressed in close, almost intimate in its confinement. Elias advanced slowly, palm brushing the wall to feel the texture, smooth in some spots, chipped in others. His light landed on faded warning labels, radiation symbols, operational instructions, designation numbers long since outdated by any modern standard. The humming intensified the farther he moved, a constant reminder that this place was still alive and not abandoned. He glanced back once more at the faint outline of the door behind him, now many paces away, only a sliver of brightness in a world swallowed by shadow. That thin line of daylight felt like the last connection to normalcy he had. Beyond it, the real forest stood vast and free. Ahead lay something hidden, purposeful, and unknown. And as the door finally eased fully shut with a heavy metallic thud, Sealing him inside, Elias Ward realized he had crossed a boundary that could never be unseen or forgotten. The forest ranger had stepped into a secret buried beneath time itself. The air vibrated with the pulse of machinery that should have fallen silent decades ago. Somewhere ahead, footsteps echoed faintly on metal flooring, too real to be a trick of his imagination. He wasn't alone. Elias stood motionless for several seconds, letting his eyes adjust as best they could to the dim illumination cast ahead of him. The flashlight beam stretched into the metallic corridor, and where the artificial light faded, a cold, steady glow from aging emergency lamps flickered sporadically along the walls. The hum of ventilation fans continued to drone far beneath the surface, sending a shiver of unease down his spine. There was something eerie in the knowledge that such machinery had been running for decades, without interruption, without maintenance from the outside world. And yet the air remained breathable. Someone had been tending to this relic. Someone was here. He advanced deeper into the bunker, each step echoing with a metallic resonance that felt too loud, too exposed. Instinct told him to walk silently, but the environment offered no such mercy. The noise traveled ahead of him, announcing his presence long before he was prepared to confront whatever lay hidden in the darkness. He tightened his grip on the flashlight and forced himself to keep his breathing even, fighting back the sensation that the air itself was narrowing around him. The first room he passed was filled with stacked metal shelves lined with crates. Dust caked the tops of the boxes, though not enough to suggest decades of neglect. Some were partially opened. Elias glimpsed rows of neatly organized canned goods. Labels faded into sepia-toned strips, but still readable. Other shelves contained plastic canisters of water, sealed medical kits, tools arranged with meticulous precision. He paused near the entrance, noticing how the dust patterns had been disturbed recently. Fingers had left trails along the edges. Footprints led in and out. Someone had been using this storage consistently. He stepped back into the corridor, scanning ahead. A crackle sounded behind him. Just the old door settling, he told himself. He needed to focus forward. The next room was larger and more complex. Control panels lined one wall, their switches still glowing faintly with amber light. Dials moved gently, gauges fluctuated, alarms blinked without urgency. Elias approached one of the panels, then hesitated. Touching anything felt like poking the ribs of a sleeping beast. A clipboard hung crookedly beside the switches, filled with handwritten logs. The dates started decades ago but didn't stop. Someone had been checking these systems daily, recording numbers without fail. Rows and rows of tiny, cramped handwriting revealed a patterned temperature, pressure, oxygen output, all logged with unwavering discipline. The most recent entry was from just a day ago. Elias felt the hair on his arms rise beneath his jacket. This bunker wasn't simply functioning, it was being monitored with absolute dedication. He moved on, careful not to disturb anything. He passed a break area, a small metal table, a single stool, a dented kettle on a heating plate. A cracked mug sat overturned, and beside it a book lay open face down, its spine almost broken from repeated readings. Elias flipped the cover gently. It was a survival manual, one he'd seen before in ranger training. But this copy was decades older, filled with margin notes, corrections, and underlines. Someone had studied it fiercely, clinging to procedure like a lifeline. A sudden metallic clank echoed through the hallway, and he froze. The sound was quick, perhaps the scrape of a shoe against steel. He turned sharply, beam shifting. Nothing. Just the narrow passage stretching out like the throat of a buried machine. His heartbeat pounded in his skull. "Hello?" he called out quietly, voice trembling despite his effort to steady it. His words were swallowed into the corridors, resonating back in faint, twisted echoes. "This is Ranger Elias Ward. I'm not here to hurt you." No reply, only the hum of air circulation. He pushed forward again, this time slower, senses sharpened to every flicker and scrape. His flashlight caught on a doorway with a faded placard. Living quarters. The door was ajar. A strip of light spilled from inside, warm, steady light. Not emergency power, not decades-old fluorescence, a modern bulb. Electricity that someone had chosen to turn on. His breath snagged. He stepped toward the doorway, nudged it gently with his foot, and angled the flashlight beam inside. The space looked shockingly lived in. A narrow cot lay against the far wall, made tightly with military precision. The blanket showed signs of recent use, folds softened, a pillow still indented where a head had rested. A small nightstand held a few personal items, a comb, a chipped mirror, a jar with a wilting plant struggling toward the artificial light. Above the cot, photos were taped to the wall, images of smiling people dressed in 1980s clothing, their hairstyles and outfits unmistakable relics of another lifetime. Elias stepped farther inside, inspecting each detail with growing disbelief. A pair of boots stood neatly beside the bed. A jacket was draped over a chair, its elbows patched but freshly cleaned. At the foot of the bed rested a toolbox, top compartment open to reveal precision instruments carefully maintained. He leaned slightly forward to examine the photos, brow furrowing. A younger man beamed in one, posing beside a military jeep. In another, he clutched a diploma, flanked by proud family, the edges of the image worn from handling. Elias had seen isolation cases before, people who disappeared into the wilderness. But this was different. This was duty. This was preparation. Something shifted behind him. He spun, flashlight aimed, body tense like an animal ready to defend itself. The beam illuminated the corridor just outside the room, empty, but he swore he'd felt movement, a presence. Then came the voice, hoarse, rough, and very close. "Who are you?" The words cut through the stillness like a blade. Elias found the source a second too late. Someone stood behind the door, half hidden by shadow. A gaunt man stepped into the frame, holding what looked like a sharpened metal rod, a makeshift spear. His hair was streaked with gray, his face lean and weathered, eyes sharp and burning with suspicion. His clothes were faded remnants of a military uniform, stitched and patched over many times. Elias raised both hands slowly, flashlight pointing away to avoid provoking him. "I'm a park ranger," he said, voice even despite the adrenaline pounding through him. "I'm here because I found the entrance open. I didn't know anyone was inside." The man didn't lower the weapon. His gaze flicked quickly, calculating escape routes, assessing threat. His breathing was shallow but controlled. This wasn't panic, it was readiness, training. He stepped farther into the light, revealing deep lines etched into his skin lines, carved by years of solitude and vigilance. "This facility is secure," the man snapped. "You shouldn't be here." "I didn't mean to intrude," Elias replied gently, "but someone left footprints outside, fresh ones. I followed them." A flicker passed through the man's expression, a crack in the armor of distrust. He tightened his grip on the spear. "Those were mine." Elias kept his voice low and steady, trying to show that he posed no danger. "How long have you been down here?" Silence stretched between them. The man's eyes drifted to the walls as if searching for answers amidst the metal. Finally he spoke, but not with the certainty Elias expected. "A long time," he muttered. "Long enough to know the world above isn't safe." Elias felt a cold knot twist in his stomach. "What do you mean?" "The war," the man said, brows furrowing as though Elias should already understand. "The nuclear strike. You shouldn't have come down here. You've been exposed. They'll follow you." For a moment the world tilted sideways. War? Nuclear strike? What was he talking about? The forest above was thriving. Birds sang. Rivers flowed. Children played in nearby towns. There was no war, but this man believed it without hesitation, and the terror in his voice was too real to dismiss as madness. Elias swallowed thickly. "What's your name?" The man hesitated, as if the question itself was a dangerous vulnerability. At last he said, "Lester. Lester Hale." The name echoed faintly in the cramped room. Lester's knuckles whitened around the spear shaft, but his posture shifted just a fraction from pure hostility to wary confusion. Elias lowered his hand slowly. "I'm not here to harm you, Lester. I just want to understand." Lester blinked, uncertainty fracturing his stern composure. He looked Elias up and down again, taking in the ranger uniform, the dirt-smudged badge, the radio at his shoulder. Elias saw realization creeping across the older man's face. Not acceptance, not trust, but the first tiny seed of possibility. Possibility that the world outside might not be the wasteland he feared. But the decades beneath the earth had carved fear deep into Lester's bones, built walls no physical barrier could match. His uncertainty morphed into urgency as he suddenly advanced a step, forcing Elias to retreat slightly. "You need to leave," Lester whispered, voice trembling now, not with aggression, but dread. "You shouldn't be here. They'll hear. You'll bring them down on us." Elias's pulse thundered. He was trapped underground with a man who had spent too many years alone, clinging to a mission built on paranoia. A man who clearly believed his survival, and now Elias's, depended on never opening that door again. But Elias couldn't retreat. Not now. Not when he had seen firsthand what loneliness and fear had done to this man. Lester wasn't an enemy. He was a prisoner locked inside a fortress he believed was protecting him. Elias steadied his breath and spoke again, quietly but firmly. "Lester, you are not alone anymore." The corridor hummed in response, the machinery echoing the words into the depths of the bunker. Lester didn't speak again, but the spear trembled faintly in his grasp. And for the first time since descending underground, Elias felt not fear, but sorrow. The secret buried in the forest was not a weapon or a threat. It was a man who had never stopped waiting for a war that never came. The tension in the air lingered, like dust, suspended in the thin beam of Elias's flashlight. Lester's grip on the makeshift spear remained tight, as if letting go would allow the entire world to collapse into the silence around them. His eyes darted from Elias to the open corridor behind him, calculating angles, distances, and threats that existed only in his memories. Elias could feel the weight of those years pressing into the small room, the fear, the abandonment, the crushing responsibility that had reshaped this man into something half feral and half soldier. Elias lowered his flashlight, pointing it now at the floor to make the light less aggressive. "Lester," he said softly, "I'm not here to harm you. You said there was a war. When did you get that message?" He tried to sound curious rather than challenging, hoping to coax the truth out gently. The older man's jaw clenched. For a moment, Elias thought he would refuse to answer entirely. But then Lester's gaze shifted upward, focusing on something only he could see. When he finally spoke, the words carried the hollow gravity of a man who had lived with them too long. "It was the morning shift," he said, voice thin but controlled. "April 26th. We'd run drills for years, and they'd always warned us one day the alarms wouldn't be practice. I was checking water filtration when the lights turned red. Sirens, automatic blast doors sealed. Protocol was clear. Lock down the facility, switch to internal power, maintain operations until contact or instructions arrived." His mouth twisted, not in bitterness, but in exhausted conviction. "So I did. I carried out the mission. I stayed operational." He turned away as though ashamed to meet Elias's eyes. "They told us the Soviets might strike with no warning, no broadcast, just silence. Silence meant destruction." His hand trembled slightly around the spear, and the silence came. Elias processed the date quickly. April 26th, 1986, the same day the world first heard the name Chernobyl. Not a nuclear strike, an accident. A disaster, yes, but not the end of civilization. To Lester, buried underground with only a static-filled emergency system, the timing must have been enough to ignite paranoia into certainty. The bunker became the only truth, and he its sole guardian. "How long?" Elias asked carefully. "Did you expect to stay put?" Lester ran a hand through his graying hair, fingers snagging on tangles and knots. "Command would have come. They were supposed to come. We trained to last months, maybe a year, supporting evacuees if they arrived. But no one came. The lights outside never returned. The radio never gave a signal. One day became two. Two became 10. Weeks turned into months." His tongue clicked softly against his teeth, as if counting something immeasurable. Then time stopped mattering. He moved past Elias, stepping into the corridor, forcing the ranger to turn so he could keep him in sight. Elias allowed the movement, giving him that space. Control, even imagined control, seemed to be the only thing keeping Lester grounded. "You lived here all this time?" Elias asked. Lester's shoulders stiffened. "I maintain this place," he corrected sharply. "There's oxygen because I kept the systems running. There's power because I repaired the generators when they failed. Supplies because I rationed and recycled and planted and rebuilt." He gestured down the hallway with the spear. This facility was designed to protect survivors. If anyone came, if humanity needed a second chance, I had to be ready. I couldn't abandon that duty just because it was taking too long. Elias fell silent. In the glow of his flashlight, the walls around them seemed less like a bunker and more like the inside of a coffin designed to preserve hope far beyond reason. Lester's entire life had been distilled into these gray corridors, purpose reduced to routine until routine became identity. This place had swallowed him whole. The man gestured stiffly for Elias to follow. Warily, Elias walked a few steps behind him. They moved into a room filled with hydroponic structures, tall frames holding trays of greens beneath powerful grow lights. Pump systems hummed as nutrient solution cycled through PVC tubing. The plants were small but vibrant lettuce, herbs, sprouts, maybe a few potatoes in soil bags near the wall. Each tray meticulously labeled in the same neat handwriting he'd seen on the log sheets. Lester's voice softened as he watched Elias examine the setup. "I learned through books," he said, motioning to a shelf overflowing with tattered manuals and binders. The seeds were part of the emergency stores. They were meant to supplement canned goods if survivors had to remain long-term. A muscle in his cheek twitched. "Long-term," he repeated, as if the phrase tasted bitter in hindsight. Elias gestured toward a cluster of small solar panels leaning against the far wall. "You installed those yourself?" "Maha." "The system wasn't built for decades of use," Lester replied, with a note of fatigue drowning out the pride in his voice. "Generators need fuel. Fuel runs out. The panels help recharge the battery banks. I scavenged wiring and retrofitted junctions." He looked away, almost embarrassed by his own ingenuity. "I had nothing but time." They continued down another corridor. Here the walls displayed faded posters about emergency conduct, fallout safety, rationing guidelines, ghosts of a threat that had never manifested. One poster showed a family huddled below ground, faces lit with hope while fire raged above. Elias felt a chill. Lester had become that family's nightmare, a lone remnant waiting for a catastrophe that refused to arrive. Lester pushed open a heavy door and stepped into a room lined with rows of old communication equipment. Radio receivers, switchboards, monitors with cracked screens, all coated in dust except one. A single station sat meticulously cleaned, headset coiled neatly beside it. A small red light glowed on the console, a standby signal. Elias approached, eyes locking onto the obsessively detailed note taped beside it. "Check frequency every hour. Do not miss a signal. Lives may depend on it." The ranger swallowed hard. "You kept listening," he said quietly. Lester nodded once, sharply. "I still do." There was no triumph in that admission, just stubbornness and heartbreak welded together. Elias's chest tightened. This was beyond loneliness. This was captivity disguised as purpose. But he couldn't push too hard, not yet. He had to earn trust first. He took a slow step closer, hands open. "Lester," Elias said, his voice steady but gentle, "there's something you need to understand. Outside, life goes on. People are alive. Towns, cities, families, children. The sky is clear. There are no bombs, no fallout." Lester's eyes flashed and he stumbled back, raising the spear protectively as if the very idea were a threat to survival. "No," he hissed. "That's what they want you to believe. They'd never reveal the truth. The minute we show ourselves, they strike. Above ground is death." "Who?" Elias asked softly. "The enemy," Lester breathed. "Anyone. Everyone. We trust no one. That is how survivors remain survivors." The desperation in his voice cut deeper than the hostility. Elias pictured a much younger man, one who might have laughed once, had dreams beyond these walls, but who now clung to one solitary belief. He was the last guard against annihilation. If that belief was taken from him, what would remain? The fear laced through Lester's every word was not simply fear of the outside. It was fear of having wasted a lifetime on a mission built from a misunderstanding. Fear that stepping out would mean confronting the truth that everything he had ever done had been for nothing. Elias tried again, taking a gentle step forward. "If there were danger out there," he said, choosing each word with care, "I wouldn't have entered alone. I wouldn't be unprotected. I'd be dressed in protective gear. And there would be signs. The forest is thriving, Lester. Nature wouldn't survive nuclear fallout. The animals wouldn't. Enough! Lester's voice cracked like breaking glass. His breathing turned ragged. He pressed his palm against his forehead, eyes squeezed shut as if trying to hold back a spiraling panic. Not again. You're trying to confuse me. I know what happened. I know what silence means. Elias stepped back, hands raised once more, not in surrender, but in respect for a trauma he did not yet fully understand. He remembered cases in search and rescue training where people disappeared into wild places, sometimes physically, sometimes mentally. But this man had been abandoned by time itself. His entire world was built on silence and fear. Living alone for decades was not survival, it was self-erasure. Lester paced a tight circle, muttering under his breath, staring at the floor as though the answers remained carved there. Elias waited, not speaking, allowing the storm to pass. Eventually Lester's eyes lifted, and the fierceness within them dimmed, replaced by something more fragile. You want to understand, he murmured, as if repeating Elias's earlier words to test them for sincerity. But you can't. You weren't here when the lights fell. You didn't count the days waiting. You didn't hear the alarms in the silence. I want to, Elias answered softly. I'm trying. Lester's jaw quivered as though he might speak again, might open a door inside himself that had been sealed as firmly as the metal one outside. But he swallowed the words, not yet ready to let them escape. Instead, he pointed the spear toward the corridor with a stiff motion. Come, he said. If you insist on staying, I'll show you what's left. Elias nodded, falling in step behind him once more. As they walked deeper into the labyrinth of the bunker, the ranger saw not a hostile survivor, but a man trapped inside a mission that no longer existed. Every hallway, every charted system, every neatly labeled supply was a stone in the prison Lester had built for himself. And yet those same stones were the only things holding him together. This place had taken everything from him: hope, trust, time. But it had also given him a purpose so powerful that he would rather deny the sun than abandon it. The bunker was his shelter, his duty, his curse. Elias knew then that saving Lester would not be as simple as opening a door to daylight. Light could blind, air could choke, and freedom could feel like death to someone who had forgotten the sky. As they moved farther into the depths, the darkness seemed to press tighter around them, as though the bunker itself refused to surrender its only guardian. Elias steadied his resolve. He had found Lester Hale. But finding a way to bring him back to the world above would be the hardest part of all. For a long moment after Lester led him deeper into the bunker, Elias resisted the urge to push any harder. The man's entire world had just been challenged by a stranger who walked in with sunlight on his clothes and truth in his voice. To Lester, truth wasn't a lifeline. It was a weapon, one that threatened to shatter the fragile foundation on which he had survived. Elias knew he needed to proceed slowly, deliberately, like coaxing a frightened animal from a trap it had lived inside long enough to believe it was home. They reached another section of the bunker, a hallway lined with heavy blast doors bearing stenciled labels: power control, water filtration, safe storage. Each door told a silent story of protocol and preparedness. Lester moved past them, his gaze constantly flicking to corners and vents, as though expecting danger to slip through the circuits. When he reached the end of the hall, he paused by a narrow staircase leading upward. This goes to the emergency hatch, he said, voice low and tense. I sealed it long ago. Too risky otherwise. He stared at the first step as if it were a vertical cliff, insurmountable. They could be waiting out there. Elias didn't answer right away. Instead, he drew a slow breath and stepped beside him, keeping his voice calm but firm. There is no they, Lester. You've been alone here all these years, alone in this bunker, cut off from the world. He braced himself for the reaction, knowing the words would cut sharply. Lester shifted his weight, staring hard at the steel under his boots, his fingers flexed around the spear shaft. I am not alone, he muttered. There are survivors, there have to be. My job is to keep this place operational until it's safe. I was trained to ensure humanity could restart here, from this bunker, if everything above burned. His voice wavered, and Elias recognized it. Not stubbornness, but fear of meaninglessness. The kind of fear that could unravel a person entirely. Elias spoke gently. What if the world didn't burn? Lester's head jerked up, panic flooding his expression. I saw the readings. I saw the alerts. Elias reached slowly into his pocket and drew out his phone. He knew the signal here was weak, barely functional, but that didn't matter. What mattered was the window into the outside world it represented. He tapped the screen, unlocking it, and held it so the glow lit the walls. Lester's eyes widened, not at the content, but at the device itself, as if witnessing technology from an era that shouldn't exist. Look, Elias urged softly. He opened his photo gallery images of the nearby town, crowded streets, a recent school field trip to the reserve, children laughing, families with dogs, a sunny market square. Then he showed landscapes, mountains where hikers climbed smiling, clear blue skies unmarred by even a trace of fallout. Lester stared as though the images were hallucinations, each one hitting him with more force than any weapon. This is false, he rasped finally, a tremor in his voice. Propaganda, psychological warfare. Then this too? Elias switched to the camera, turning the screen so Lester saw his own reflection for the first time in years. Gaunt face, wild eyes, gray hair sticking like brittle roots in every direction. Elias stepped beside him, so they both appeared in the frame. Two men from two different worlds, standing shoulder to shoulder. This is real, Lester. So is everything else. Lester stumbled backward, spine pressing into the steel wall behind him. His breath came shallow and fast, like an animal trying to outrun an argument. Elias saw panic twisting across his features and instantly regretted the pressure. He lowered the phone slowly, letting the bunker's dim emergency glow reclaim dominance over the digital clarity. The older man's eyes began to well with tears he fought desperately not to shed. His fingers clutched his hair as he squeezed his eyes shut. No, he whispered hoarsely. You don't understand. If the world is still there, if people are alive and thriving and free, then what have I done? His hands fell to his sides, the spear clattering to the floor with a metallic echo that felt painfully symbolic. I've wasted everything. The silence that followed was so vast that Elias feared the bunker might collapse under its weight. Elias took a quiet step closer and spoke with a calm conviction that came from years of helping frightened hikers and runaways face their fears. You did what you believed was right. You followed your mission. You tried to protect life. He paused, making sure Lester heard every word. You survived. That's not a waste. That's strength. Lester's breathing slowed, but his head hung low, his eyes refusing to meet Elias's. Shame had taken hold, shame for years he would never regain, for sunlight he had forgotten, for a life that existed beyond concrete walls and ration logs. Elias placed a hand softly on Lester's shoulder. The man flinched at the unfamiliar gesture, then remained still, trembling faintly. Come with me, Elias urged. Let me show you. Let me take you outside. You'll see the forest, hear the wind, feel the sun. Just one step at a time. Lester's eyes widened with raw fear. No, he croaked. I can't. The surface, it kills. The radiation. Elias shook his head. There is none here. Trees don't grow in poison soil. Animals don't thrive in fallout. He met Lester's gaze and held it firmly. You saw the forest. Healthy. Green. Alive. That alone should tell you something. But logic could not conquer terror so easily. Lester backed away until his spine struck the wall again, his hands curled into fists as if the very thought of freedom suffocated him. I can't, he said again, voice barely audible. I've lived too long in the dark. Elias kept his tone steady. Then don't look at the sky yet. Just look at the door. Stand near it. You don't have to go through. Not right away. He extended a hand, slow and careful, like one would approach a wild creature that had forgotten how to trust. Lester stared at that hand as though it were a ghostly invitation. A hesitant breath escaped his lips. The shaking in his legs was visible. Finally, painfully, he reached out. Their fingers touched. Lester's palm was rough, calloused, cold. Step by step, Elias guided him back down the corridor, each pace measured and fragile. The stairwell leading upward loomed like a monument to a forgotten life. Lester hesitated at the base, breath ragged. Elias said nothing, simply stayed beside him, a solid presence. Together they ascended, slowly, until they reached the upper landing. The heavy outer door stood slightly ajar from Elias's entrance. A thin sliver of daylight cut across the floor, sharp and golden. Dust motes danced like tiny galaxies caught between worlds. Lester stared at that line of light as though it were the blade of time itself. He couldn't step closer. His body rebelled, every muscle coiling with primal dread. His knees buckled, and he sank against the wall, covering his face with his hands as silent sobs racked his frame. Elias knelt beside him, one hand steady on his shoulder. "It's okay," he murmured. "It's okay to be afraid. You've been here too long, but you're not alone anymore." Lester shook his head weakly. "I hear the birds," he whispered, as if confessing to a hallucination. "Real birds, not the recordings I play at night." Elias nodded. "Yes, real birds. That's the world waiting for you." But Lester couldn't do it. Not yet. Terror kept him chained, even with freedom within arm's reach. Elias didn't push further. He eased the door closed again, allowing the sanctuary of the bunker to settle around Lester like a blanket familiar, if stifling. One small victory had been won. Lester had climbed the stairs. He had seen daylight. He had acknowledged the truth, if only for a fleeting heartbeat. That alone exhausted him. Elias helped him back downstairs to his living quarters. The older man collapsed onto his cot, face pale and eyes wide as if the brief encounter with sunlight had drained him more than years of solitude. He clutched the blanket in both hands as though steadying himself against a shifting world. Elias sat nearby, not intruding, simply present. He knew better than to fill silence with empty words. Lester needed space to process the collapse of a belief that had defined him longer than most people lived in their youth. After a long while, Lester spoke again, his voice brittle. "If I leave, who will guard this place? What if someone needs it one day?" Elias leaned forward. "Then we'll decide together. You won't lose the bunker. But you can't protect anyone if you stay locked inside it forever." Lester blinked slowly, considering that. He didn't argue. Outside, in the world he had forgotten, day continued on. Children laughed somewhere miles away. Golden leaves rustled in the breeze. Clouds drifted lazily across a clean sky. Life, in all its stubborn resilience, refused to match the apocalypse he'd prepared for. But inside the bunker, time remained cautious. Lester had cracked the door to truth, and the unknown beyond still terrified him more than nuclear fire ever had. Elias could see the battle unfolding behind the man's tired eyes, and he knew the hardest step of all was still ahead. Elias remained in the bunker longer than he had expected, not because he feared leaving, but because he feared what might happen if he rushed Lester to follow. The man sat hunched on the edge of his cot, fingers clutching the blanket so tightly that his knuckles turned the color of bone. His breathing finally steadied, but his eyes still held the distant look of a soldier stuck between duty and ruin. The small room that had once represented safety now looked more like a tomb, its walls closing in on decades of silent suffering. Elias knew this next step, the step into the unknown above, would be the true test. He allowed the quiet to stretch, giving Lester's mind room to acclimate. Eventually he stood and spoke with a determined calm. "We should make a plan, nothing sudden, no leaps, slowly and together." Lester did not respond, but the line in his shoulders softened just enough for Elias to continue. "First, we'll spend some time here in the main corridor, closer to the stairs. You'll get used to being near the exit, bit by bit." That became their routine. Each morning, though morning was only measured by clocks and not the sun that Lester feared, Elias would guide him up to the stair landing. There Lester would pause, gripping the railing, listening to the faint, muffled sounds above. Birds, wind, a distant creak, real, living things. Sometimes those sounds seemed to comfort him. Sometimes they sparked terror. Yet every day he stood closer to the light than the day before, even if just by inches. Between these sessions, Elias helped him maintain the bunker's systems, not because they were needed anymore, but because routine grounded Lester's unraveling identity. They fixed minor leaks in pipes, replaced filters with supplies that had been stored away for decades, checked the composting unit for the hydroponic garden. It was work Lester understood, and in that understanding, he found a fragile stability. The ranger would ask questions about how he had adapted so thoroughly to underground life, and Lester, despite himself, felt a flicker of pride as he explained his careful methods. Pride, he would learn, was the first step away from despair. When they rested, Elias encouraged memories. On rare occasions, Lester would speak of the young man he once was, eager, certain, ambitious. He had a brother somewhere, a handful of childhood friends, and once, a girl he had thought he might marry. Her name he said only once, with such trembling reverence that Elias knew not to repeat it. Talking about the past hurt, but it reminded Lester that he had lived before the bunker, that his life did not begin with the steel coffin. The changes were slow, almost imperceptible day by day, but undeniable as the week progressed. Lester walked with less stiffness. He slept without clutching the blankets in fear. He looked Elias in the eyes more often. He listened when Elias spoke of the reserve, of tourists, of technology and news reports and things that sounded too futuristic for the man who had left the world in the 1980s. Each detail widened a crack in the wall built of old assumptions and ancient dread. Then came the morning that Elias decided they needed to try again, truly try, to leave. He didn't announce it. He simply helped Lester up the stairs like always. But something in the air felt different. Perhaps it was subtle, the way Lester didn't drag his feet, or the fact that he reached the top step without prompting. Elias pushed gently on the sealed door until a gap opened wide enough to paint the floor with sunlight. The golden beam stretched across their boots, warm and undeniable. Lester stared at it. The tightness in his jaw betrayed the battle raging inside. Elias stepped closer, close enough for their shoulders to touch. "You have the strength," he said quietly. "You've had it all along." Lester swallowed hard. The bunker's filtered air wasn't enough anymore. Now that he knew the world above was breathing freely. Slowly, he reached toward that bar of light. His fingers trembled as they hovered above it, afraid to cross the boundary. His breath caught, broken and uneven, and then he stepped forward. His foot moved into the sunbeam, toes bathed in warmth he had not felt in decades. The reaction was instant. His breath hitched. Tears sprang unbidden to his eyes. He jerked backward, heart pounding wildly, as if he'd almost walked into death. Elias steadied him with a hand against his back. "It's all right," he whispered, though his own heart raced in empathy. "It's all right. You did it. You touched the light." It took a long moment for Lester to stop shaking, but when he looked down at his foot, still alive, something inside him cracked open. Not fear, relief, hope. This time he stepped forward again, and then another step, and another. The light rose up his legs, casting away years of shadows. Elias kept one hand lightly on his arm, guiding him but letting him lead. The door creaked wider, the slice of forest expanding like a new universe revealing itself. Pine scent drifted inside, rich and earthy. A breeze brushed Lester's face, so gentle, so soft, that he gasped, reaching up to touch the air as if it were a physical miracle. He stepped fully outside. The forest embraced him in its endless expanse. Tall pine trees stretched toward a sky so blue it almost hurt to look at. Sunlight clung to every branch, every rock, every blade of grass. The world seemed impossibly big, overwhelming to a man who had lived inside quarters less than 2 strides wide. The first bird call brought a sob from his throat, sharp and unrestrained. He stumbled forward, knees buckling in the soil, as his hands sank into moss and leaves. He breathed in deep, desperate gulps, his lungs flooding with scents richer than steel and concrete. This was the life he had forgotten existed, the kind that did not hum with artificial fans, but throbbed with the heartbeat of the earth. Elias crouched beside him, watching quietly as Lester's tears streaked down his dust-stained cheeks. There was no shame now, no hiding, only release. Lester's eyes tracked the arc of a hawk gliding above the canopy, wings wide, effortless against the sprawling sky. For that moment, the bunker below ceased to exist. The weight of decades lightened, just enough for him to breathe freely. When the flood of sensations became too much, Lester leaned back and closed his eyes. Elias remained there, solid and real, a reassuring presence that grounded him against the tidal wave of newness. After a long, trembling breath, Lester whispered, "It's beautiful." Elias nodded, feeling the truth of those words settle deep within. "It always was," he replied softly. "You just needed to see it again." They took their time, minutes, maybe hours, letting Lester exist in that space between rebirth and raw fear. He did not wander far. A few steps away from the door felt like miles for a man reborn. But every new sound, every fluttering leaf, every touch of wind on his skin fed strength into muscles that had forgotten life above ground. Eventually, Elias helped him to his feet. Lester wiped his eyes with the back of his hand and managed a small, uncertain smile. "What happens now?" he asked, the question so vulnerable it nearly broke Elias's heart. "Now," Elias said, "we go back for a while, rest, and tomorrow we come out again. And the next day, until this place," he gestured to the sky, the trees, the wide open world, "feels like home again." Lester looked once more at the forest, that miracle of survival he had once believed impossible. Then he nodded and followed Elias down the steps. The door to the bunker whispered shut behind them, but this time it closed not to trap him, but to wait. Lester walked beside his guide with tentative steps, but no longer dragging chains of denial. The battle was far from over. He still had fears to conquer, memories to rebuild, a life to rediscover. But he was no longer buried. For the first time in decades, the former guardian of the underground walked, knowing what he had protected survived, and that he too had survived to see it. Tomorrow he would take another step into sunlight, and the world would not burn. Lester had expected that after taking those first steps into sunlight, the world would instantly reclaim him. That freedom would feel like an open gate and a running start. But freedom, he quickly learned, was not a single moment of victory. It was a slow, fragile process of trust regrowing inside a man who had lived too long in fear. Though he returned to the bunker after that breakthrough, the walls no longer felt like protection. They felt like memories of a life he was finally beginning to leave behind. Elias stayed by his side over the following days, never pushing too quickly, but never allowing Lester to sink back into solitude. They continued their slow climbs to the surface, each time emerging a little farther from the doorway. On the second day, Lester stood fully outside for several minutes, staring upward as clouds shifted lazily across a blue so wide he could barely comprehend it. On the third, he took a few steps into the open clearing, his boots sinking slightly into the soft soil as his heartbeat thundered with equal parts fear and exhilaration. He spoke more often now, though quietly, as if unused to the idea that his voice deserved to exist in open air. He asked questions about the world above, and Elias answered each one without hesitation. Letters, the internet, new countries, cures for diseases, people walking on the moon again. So many things had changed, yet the basics remained familiar. Families gathered for meals, schools taught children, farmers tended crops. Humanity had moved forward while the bunker had stayed frozen. The hardest thing for Lester to accept was that no one had been left behind intentionally. There was no grand conspiracy, no silent war, just a glitch in information, a terrible coincidence, and a loyal soldier who never stopped following orders. Elias radioed his station in the town once he knew Lester would not try to flee or harm himself. He reported that he had found an isolated survivalist in need of medical evaluation and psychological support. But he kept the full story guarded until Lester was ready to share it himself. The day the response team would arrive was coming. But Elias wanted Lester to be prepared, not ambushed by the modern world. One morning, as dew clung to the mossy stones and the sun crept over the mountain ridge, the two men sat on a fallen log overlooking the tree line. Lester held a cup of tea Elias had brewed over a small camp stove, a luxury he had nearly forgotten. He sipped slowly, savoring a simple comfort he had been denied for decades. "I've been thinking," Lester said quietly, not yet daring to look Elias in the eyes. "If the world is truly at peace, if all those people are living normal lives, then maybe," he paused, wrestling with a lifetime of conditioning, "maybe I don't have to be a guardian anymore." Elias smiled gently. "You never stopped being one, Lester. You safeguarded yourself too. even if the danger wasn't what you thought. Lester huffed a shaky laugh. I was preparing for a future that already happened without me. His gaze drifted to the towering pines. So what do I do now? I can't point a gun at shadows or inspect gauges for alarms that aren't coming. My life, my mission, it's over. That mission is over, Elias agreed. But that doesn't mean you can't have another. Lester's hand stilled around the warm mug. Another? Yes, Elias said. You know survival better than anyone. You know discipline, resilience, and how to build life from scraps. There are people who could learn from you, and people who would simply be grateful you're still here. Lester absorbed that in silence. A new mission, a new purpose. It was terrifying to imagine, but also strangely hopeful. Elias stood and extended a hand toward him. Walk with me. They followed a narrow trail through the forest, sunlight flickering like gold coins through the leaves. The deeper they went, the more life surrounded them. Squirrels darting up trunks, insects humming their endless songs, the wind stirring the treetops like waves over a green ocean. Every sound felt like a reminder that existence did not rely on steel walls and emergency alarms. It thrived in the open. Eventually, the trees parted and a small wooden cabin stood ahead, Elias's ranger outpost. Smoke curled faintly from the chimney, and 2 trail maps hung near the porch. It was modest, but compared to the bunker's suffocating corridors, it looked like a palace. Lester stopped short, breath catching. Is this where you stay? Sometimes, Elias said. It's a resting point for long patrols. And today, he added, opening the door, it's yours to explore. Lester stepped inside cautiously, as though the building might vanish if he moved too quickly. The sunlight through the windows illuminated polished wood walls and shelves lined with books. A radio crackled quietly in the corner, broadcasting soft chatter from town officials. There were postcards from places Lester had once dreamed of seeing, oceans, deserts, cities sparkling with lights. It was too much and yet exactly what he needed. Elias placed a folded navy blue garment on the table. These are new clothes from the station, something to help you transition. Lester stared at them, fingers brushing the fabric. It had been decades since he had worn something that wasn't cut down from military surplus. He swallowed a lump in his throat. Will I meet people? He asked cautiously. Yes, Elias answered. When you're ready. They'll help. They'll listen. A simple statement, but it felt like opening another sealed door. Over the next few hours, Elias guided him through ordinary tasks, sweeping the floor, fetching water from the pump, adjusting the cabin's radio antenna. Every small act reminded Lester that life above ground did not demand constant vigilance. It welcomed participation, encouraged interaction. Later, as dusk began to settle and the sky painted itself in shades of orange and violet, the 2 men sat outside by a small fire. Lester warmed his hands over the flames, mesmerized by their gentle crackle, a far cry from the mechanized drone that had defined his decades underground. When the team arrives, Elias said, watching him carefully, they'll take you somewhere safe. A doctor will check on your health. They'll ensure you're supported. You won't be alone. Not anymore. Lester nodded, the flames reflected in his eyes. For the first time, those eyes carried more hope than fear. You found me, he murmured. You pulled me out of the dark. No, Elias replied softly. You walked out yourself. I just held the door open. The stars began to appear one by one, glittering above the treetops. Lester leaned back, gazing at them with awe. He whispered almost reverently, I forgot how many there were. They never left, Elias said. They were always waiting for you. Lester's chest rose with a deep, steady breath, not the rapid, panicked ones he had lived on for years, but a full inhale of life he knew he deserved. He was no longer the last guard of a forgotten war. He was a survivor with a future. He turned to Elias, something new and determined settling behind his gaze. I want to help. If there's work to be done, if I can protect people here, in this world, not from bombs or fallout, but from getting lost like I did, then maybe that's what I'm meant for now. Elias nodded, feeling pride swell inside him. You will help, more than you can imagine. As the fire crackled and night embraced the forest, Lester felt a peace he hadn't known since he first walked into the bunker all those years ago. The dawn of his new mission was rising, one built not on fear, but on connection, not on hiding, but on stepping forward. The bunker would remain, a relic of a world that feared extinction. But Lester Hale, once its prisoner, was free. And tomorrow, when the sun rose over the pines again, he would rise with it.